at least as much as I am. Hi, I'm Daniel. I'm on the Nuxt core team. My background before working in open source full-time was as a CTO of a small SaaS startup, and then before that I had, again, a small creative agency. So my experience is really very much as a user of Nuxt, as somebody who's built projects, and so developer experience means a lot to me because I know exactly what it's like when it doesn't feel great. I live in England. This is where I normally spend my time, so if I am on Discord or Twitter or anything like that, I'm probably in that chair looking out at one of my cats drinking a cup of tea. I've got to say, I love being in Amsterdam, though. There is nothing quite like seeing people face to face again. I mean, dialing in online is wonderful. It's a privilege, but this is so much better, I think. And then turning to the really important topic of this afternoon, these are my 3 cats and dog, and I will be taking questions later. Feel free to come up to me. It's Gulliver, Lily, Barley, and Riley. Riley is a very good dog. So I want to talk about developer experience in Nuxt 3. And I think I'm probably on safe ground here when I say that developer experience is an unadulterated good. There's nothing the matter in seeking better developer experience, is there? It's better for everybody. It's better for the developer who is coding, who is able to put their ideas into practice faster, more easily, better, who isn't taken out of that moment of creativity. It's better for the company that employs the developer. They get better work faster. It helps the bottom line. And I think we can say it's not a vicious circle when we all strive for better developer experience. It's a virtuous circle. So very much what I'm going to talk about today is what we've done in Nuxt to improve developer experience. But I really welcome seeing other frameworks doing similar things. And I hope they steal things from us. And I hope we can steal things from them too. Because everyone benefits when developer experience gets better. I want you to think for a moment, when have you felt most productive? When have you felt most able to flourish as a developer? Just take a moment to think of your answer. Now, there's lots that goes into that, and I don't want to go into most of it, which is probably more important than the tooling side. But there is a degree to which tooling makes a huge difference to developer productivity and creativity. And I like to think of it in terms of 2 axes. On the one hand, you have that ability to make amazing things. And on the other hand, you have all of the annoying things that constrain you. I'm not talking about genuine business constraints. That's part of the fun, right? But the annoying things like lint rules and configuring build pipelines and things like that. And basically, I think my job as part of a team working on a framework to enable developers to build is to reduce that constraint as much as possible to 0, as far as we can get there. Because as much as we do that, we unleash your ability and the ability of anyone using Nuxt to create amazing things. So the vision is to be as minimal as possible, as lightweight as possible, and to reduce context switching. So again, leveraging TypeScript to enable you to do everything in the moment. You don't need to switch to docs. You don't need to ask someone. It's all there for you in your IDE. So I want to talk about 3 different ways we do that. And the first is that as much as possible in Nuxt 3, we've sought to make everything fully typed. Now, this doesn't mean you have to use TypeScript, by the way. This works no matter what you're writing your code in, whether it's JavaScript or TypeScript. But for the first time, we take full control of your IDE. We do this by generating a tsconfig.json. And then within that file, we can do all the magic we want to. So in there, we set your paths. So every alias that's defined in your Nuxt project, whether that's by Nuxt or some other module that you're using or some additional library that you have built or some other team in your company has built, it's all available to you when you start typing import from. No extra config required. Not just that, you get full type hinting for everything else that we provide in Nuxt. I'm going to show you a little bit about that in a moment. The second key thing that we're doing, which is actually quite partial, but I want to tell you about the direction we're going in, is that we want documentation to be, as much as possible, at the point of use. Now, documentation is a funny thing, and there are different uses for documentation. You can go to a tutorial, you can, how do I solve this problem? You can ask the question, I'm completely new to Nuxt, I don't know where to start, and maybe you want some kind of a guide. But a lot of documentation, my use of documentation and others as well is, what does this function do? What's the significance of that second argument? What if I set server true? What does that do? And actually, there's a huge need for moving as much documentation as we can, including code examples, links, and other things, into your editor. We do this right now with the Nuxt configuration. So we actually have written an entire package called untyped that allows you to create a configuration schema. It can resolve configuration using other values. It's quite complex, and it's amazing and fun, and you should check it out. It's part of the JS project that Vuejs was talking about a little bit earlier. But it also allows us to take all of the documentation that we create in that schema and stick it in the type files and make it available to your IDE, as well as taking that, generating Markdown, and publishing it on the Nuxt 3 website. And we have a lot more plans for this, by the way. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that in a moment. The second thing we do, apart from the TypeScript support we add, is we, as much as possible, seek to get rid of boilerplate. If I could reduce your need for a Nuxt project to be one file, I would do it. But as it is, it's not too bad. Out of the box, a Nuxt 3 project is going to come with 4 significant files. An app.vue, which is where you're going to start your application, the Nuxt config, which is empty and probably can stay that way, a package.json with 1 dependency, Nuxt, and that magic TS config that I told you about. Everything else is unlocked at the point of need, based on what you do, based on how you build your project, because you shouldn't have to worry about boilerplate. Some of what that means, we provide functions to be auto-imported. So if you're using Vue 3, then you'll be using ref, on-mounted, reactive, all kinds of useful functions that you want to use throughout your project. Adding imports for them, even if it is partially auto-completed by your IDE, is noise. It doesn't help you in your code. It hinders. And so Nuxt 3, you don't have to do that. In server or client, as much as possible, we import automatically the utilities that we know you'll need. And it's not just the ones we know you'll need, but the ones that modules you're using declare as well. If you're using some integration with a CMS, for example, and that CMS adds their own composable imports, they can be added to your project too. All of that, again, it works with full type support. So hover over computed or any of those other auto-imported functions, and you'll get perfect type support in your editor. That means you can do something beautiful like this component. I mean, it's not wonderful. But it is as minimal as I think I could possibly make it. We also try and get rid of some of the other boilerplate that you will come across time and time again when you're doing data fetching. So we provide this $fetch, isomorphic fetch we call it. There are 2 different things that it does. One is that it's isomorphic, so it can handle that mocked server API call that Vuejs was talking about a few moments ago. But the other is it brings so much in terms of user experience benefits to you. And you can actually access it out of a Nuxt project entirely just by importing it from omyfetch. But it will smartly look at the response headers of any fetch request. It uses the standard API for fetch options. But the response, it smartly parses. It figures out, is this text, is this JSON, is it an array buffer, is it something else? And it gives you that. So what you're expecting. And it types it for you as well. So you actually get the type in your editor of what you're getting back, as long as it's not a completely unknown third-party website. The second thing we do is that in the server functions that Nuxt provides, you're actually able to directly return objects, JSON, for example. So forget set header, content type, application, JSON, res, end, JSON, stringify, whatever. You can actually just directly return it. And that isn't just great EX. It also powers the type inference that we're able to give you. So when you actually fetch from that endpoint, it is typed for you. And I hope all of these things are going in the same direction, right? It feels like this is a consistent move that should make your life easier. So not only is stuff typed, but it's also zero config. So Nuxt 2 was like this in the pages directory, because you only had to create a page, a file, something about.vue in pages, and instantly it got turned into a server, it got turned into a Vue router root, there was bundle splitting involved, it was magic. And I think for many people first using Nuxt, that was probably an experience that made them want to keep using it. For Nuxt 3, it's that times, well, literally in this case, 7. But actually, more, I would say. Everything that you can think of in your Nuxt project is zero config. Create a component in your components directory, use it anywhere else, and it will be automatically imported only in that file. You can even generate dynamic imports by using a lazy name of your component. Stick an export in the composables directory, and it will automatically be made available in your project as an auto-importable composable file, like ref and reactive and all those other things I was talking about a moment ago. You'll get, again, full type support for that, and click back into the source file when you hover over it. Your Nuxt middleware also automatically made available to you. That would happen in Nuxt 2 as well. But now you get type support for it. So when you're actually in your pages wanting to say what your middleware is, you'll get a nice drop-down. And you can add global middleware, which will automatically be added and run in your project. Pages is exactly the same, with a few but delicious improvements in terms of the syntax of declaring the pages. It supports a lot more complex pattern matching. If you're ever trying to build a Twitter clone or something like that, you're going to be a lot happier with the Nuxt pages support in Nuxt 3. And plugins are automatic too. Likewise, in the server directory, anything in your API folder becomes a root, and anything in your middleware folder gets run on every server request. Now, I want to show you a little bit about what that looks like. And I should say, before I do that, that all of what I've been talking about actually works with theme support. So if you were to want to create another theme for your Nuxt project, for example, stick it in another folder, create some components, point a different Nuxt project to that, exactly as I've put in the code there, and you'll find that everything automatically imports into your new project, and you're given full IDE support for it. This is literally all the configuration you need to do to get that working with themes. So let's dive in. So this is a Nuxt project, new and out of the box. It's not got a lot going for it. The first thing I'm going to do is install Nuxt content, Tailwind CSS, Pico CSS, and Tailwind CSS, just to give me a bit of styling to go. And at the same time, I'll start, or in a moment, I'll start the Nuxt dev server. What we're going to do in the Nuxt config is actually pull in some of those modules that we just added. Let me know if this is too small for anybody. Okay, so we've got that up and running. By the way, a big difference you'll notice from Nuxt 2 is that if you actually then want to edit your Nuxt config, you'll find that it's already type aware of the modules that you're using. So the config you might want to provide to the content module is there for you, and you get all that support out of the box. Everything starts in your app.vue file, and if you don't create a pages directory, you don't get the Vue router support. Instead, what you get is a universal router, we call it. It has a lot of the same properties. You can still use Nuxt links. You can do all kinds of useful things like that. But it just doesn't come with the extra burden on your bundle. It's obviously less capable than Vue router, which is amazing. But some apps don't need that. I'd like to import Pico CSS as well. And I think probably we can split the screen, start the dev server, and just show you what that Nuxt project looks like out of the box. Nothing, because I haven't put anything in yet. Let's create a header. So we'll have a little nav, maybe, and we might want to have a bit of navigation. We'll call this one medium. That should do. We might also want to do a couple of other things. There we go. Thank you. 20 minutes later of debugging, Daniel's wondering what went so terribly wrong. Might want to create a login button as well. Okay. So out of the box, you would stick everything in this one file. But in this particular case, we probably want to make it a little nicer. So something like that. We probably want to create a pages directory. So we'll create the index.vue file, and that's going to be what's going to be loaded here. We'll just stick some some boilerplate there. And then in your app.vue, you get to swap it out for Nuxt page, which is actually now going to be pointing to this new component that will render it. You'll see we get type support for this. I should have showed you this before creating the pages directory, because a lot of what Nuxt does for you is conditional on what you're doing in your project. So actually, the Nuxt page component didn't exist in the Nuxt context before I created that folder. If I had created it, it wouldn't have given me a hover here. It wouldn't have given me that type support, and I certainly couldn't have clicked to go to see what the source code was. But now I can. When I actually go into that page, you should see I have welcome there. We're going to make this just quite simple. So the idea is I might make a little article listing site. Here are some articles. And the reason I want to do that is I want to show you a little bit about how Nuxt content plays well with Nuxt in terms of dev experience. So we're going to create some articles. Here's one, foo. And we're just going to create some paragraphs of boilerplate and give it a title. There we go. We've got some content. So at this point, we might want to iterate over that content. It will look a little bit like this, right? We're going to want to have a heading with a title. We're going to want to have a bit of a description of the article. And we're going to want to have a link that goes to that article. So it's going to be to something like articles, test, and it's going to be read more, something like that. So that should be about what we want it to look like. Now we want to hook this up to some real data. Now Nuxt provides some really powerful data fetching utilities, because one of the things you face when you're looking at a framework which runs isomorphically, so on the server or on the edge as well as on the client, is you need to create an ability to avoid fetching data twice. You want to be able to fetch it, for example, on the server and not have to do that again on the client side. So we're going to use something called use async data. We're going to give it a key, and we're going to pass it a query content helper, which is auto-imported by the Nuxt content module for us. And we're going to particularly look for everything at the articles path. We're going to get all of it. So we should now have a list of articles, just one of them, mind you, and we'll iterate over that. You should see, by the way, that we have some nice type support for that. And we're going to want to make this a little bit more interesting, so article title. And we might want to do the same then for the description and the path. There we go. So we seem to have our content here. Bear with me. I'll give that a go. The the articles that we're creating here are coming from the server side. We don't actually need all the properties from each of them. Can someone see what I'm using here? It isn't quite right. Aha. I've done something crazy in app. Well, for a moment, what we're going to do is a quick bit of debugging. This actually seems to be working fine at the moment. How strange. Am I using some... It's not heading. Did any of you think heading isn't an HTML element? It's header. Daniel, what are you thinking? Apologies for that detour. We're going to restrict the properties that come back from that endpoint, swiftly moving on to just a few interesting ones. So the path, the title, and the description. And we might want to do something like create another article. So we would just create another one here. Give it some content. And everything beautifully appears for us there. I'm going to show you a little bit more. So we might want to make a plugin, for example. In this particular example, we'll create a tiny minimal auth plugin. So this auth plugin is going to simply export a function. And we can take advantage of a very cool thing that Nuxt 3 does, which is that you can provide through a return object. So we want to provide an auth object here, which will have some interesting properties. We'll start with, say, logged in is going to be false. And then we're going to have a login method, which is going to eventually change that, I think, probably. And a logout method, which is going to do a similar kind of thing. Let's go into our app. And now actually make this dependent on that. We only want to show that login button if you're not logged in. You'll see that Nuxt has made my IDE aware that this injection exists. So I can actually check whether it exists or not. And if it doesn't exist, then I obviously can hide the login button. I might also want to do to create a logout button, so something like this. So at the moment, we should have a log in button and a log out button. Something like that. Well, that's what we would expect. We'll go into the auth plugin, and we'll make this a little bit more interesting. So we might want to have our state, our logged in state, as a little ref. And then we're going to maybe manipulate it in our login and logged out here. So logged in value is true, and logged in value is false. I wouldn't recommend this as an approach for coding. Make this a button as well, and we will also just pass it a click handler. So we should find that we can log in and log out using a central Nuxt plugin. You will do something much, much more interesting than that. Let's try and add some Nuxt middleware. So we're going to create a new middleware folder and make a global middleware. And in here, we're actually going to do something, again, which is a bit of a dummy. This isn't how you would do it in reality. You'd have some more code, a little bit more code. We'll create an API folder that will give us a user endpoint. So we'll just return a value, which is going to be Daniel, location, Amsterdam. And so we're going to fetch that in our middleware. So we might want to say, is the user logged in? And we might want, say, to have a verify feature. We're going to fetch that user endpoint. We'll make that async. Now, one of the great things, of course, with the server endpoints is that you do get the type support for it. But we won't particularly look into that at the moment. We just want this to work. So we'll first check Great. If we can probably skip this for the login path. All we want to do is prevent the reading a particular article if you are not logged in. So we can say if not is logged in and to.path starts with articles, then we are simply going to return navigate to the index. Something like that. Terrible, but simple. Brilliant. Now, this is a global middleware, which means it's going to run on every route every time we navigate anywhere. Again, a terrible way to do it. We don't want to actually run network requests on every route navigation. But in this particular case, we should see we haven't created a path for this. We can actually do this quite simply. Articles, we'll make a dynamic slug using the new Nuxt root syntax. We'll create a template, and we use the new content doc component from Nuxt content that will automatically look at the path and figure out if there's an article or other piece of content that matches it. So we should now be able to click that button and just checking that we have the current path available for us. Should be able to click that button, and it shouldn't allow us to navigate to that page. Except that we're always returning true to our login endpoint. So we could probably just return false in this case. Or we could actually investigate our logged in token. Something like that. So we now should not be able to navigate, because we're not logged in. But as soon as we do log in, it makes that network request and now allows us to navigate to the page. I hope you very much won't hold my particular failings as I've been navigating through this project against me. Nuxt itself is phenomenal in terms of developer experience. I hope you see that the power that some of that type safety gives. It allowed me to avoid making mistakes about the auth function. You have a type check utility that you can actually call once you actually are building your project, or if you just want to check that everything is working correctly. And it means that data should flow seamlessly from the source of truth, whether that's your server API endpoint, whether that's the plugin you've defined it, your middleware, your component, or anyone else, straight through into your code. But it's not just zero config in terms of creating each of these different files in these directories. It's also zero config when it comes to deployment. You can build any app and deploy it to any supported Nitro provider. Most of them offer zero config. So for example, Versal, this is a zero config set of deployments I put up, less than a minute each one. And the same from Netlify. This is just the most recent deployment. And there are lots of others that are zero config, and many, many more which are minimal, i.e. the provider requires you to create a small config yourself. And I think that hugely increases developer pleasure, certainly on my end, when you're not having to configure your deployment pipeline, or you're able to switch from one to the other pretty seamlessly. Here are some of the things we have planned. Magic keys for use state, use async data, and fetch. So you don't actually need to create those one-off keys. There's a PR in progress. You can expect that to land soon. Some more command line love for Nuxt. At the moment, you can use it to create new boilerplate. You can create new plugins, middleware, other things, and there's a lot more coming in terms of installing modules for you, adding the dependencies that you require. For example, if you need a new integration with another provider or piece of software. Nuxt functions, taking the whole concept of server routes to another level. So you can actually pass parameters, fully typed objects and other things, and get that run on the server side for you. And surfacing errors and more info in DevTools, so that when you're actually debugging your app in the browser, you can see everything right there for you. What's more, once we have a little task to do in terms of moving the Nuxt 3 documentation to Dockers, which is going to be quite fun. But at that point, we'll have a full sync between the documentation that's on the website and the documentation that's available to you in your editor when you're using each of the Nuxt composables. And finally, one of my favorites, you will get complete type hinting available when you're using your Nuxt config, resolved to the particular configuration setup you have in your project with your directories, not some kind of generic one-size-fits-all config. Well, I've had a lot to say. There is so much to love about Nuxt 3. Please give it a try. Visit v3.nextjs.org, install it, let me know what you think. I'd love you to message me, drop me a DM, and I'll do my best to answer any questions you might have. Be a rubber duck if I possibly can. And do follow Nuxt.js. There are a lot more interesting things coming on Twitter than I can talk about today. But thank you very much, Vuejs Amsterdam. It's been a pleasure.